Great. We've got 7 people that have signed in right now. So right now we're just going to be getting some of the attendees that were waiting for us to start the webinar. Susie, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, maybe what we'll do is just give it a minute for those to sign on. And I don't know where I put my cover page now.
Do you want me to find it?
Sure.
All right, I'll just load that up right now.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. You've got 22 people who just signed in.
Okay. Well, I think we'll get going here then. Just let me. There we go. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending the second of our winter webinars. This one's on shoreline health. For everybody that was on our forestry presentations, you know this already, but we were unable to hold our watershed management plan annual review meeting this year because of obvious reasons. So we chose to set up a series of webinars to provide information that came across our desk that were comments or concerns over the year. And shoreline health was one of them. So to start off, I just want to go over some housekeeping items for the webinar. Quickly, I want to introduce you to Christina Anderson. She's the Regional District Watershed Planner in Grand Forks and also the background IT support for these. So thank you very much for all your help running these. You save a lot of time for me, I think. The webinar is recorded and it'll be available to watch afterwards through a link on the Christina Lake Stewardship Society's website, which is lakesteward.ca. It's not going to be immediately on there, but it'll be up there within a week or so. For the bulk of the webinar, the attendees are going to be muted. You'll notice too that your photo doesn't appear as it would if you were on a Zoom meeting. If you're on the phone, you'll also be muted, but you can unmute your phone on most phones by pressing *6. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. It's like a cartoon kind of comment icon. And you can use this if you have questions or comments on technical issues. So if you're not hearing a speaker or if your screen sharing is not working, put a comment in there and we'll be monitoring that to make sure that everything's kind of running smoothly. We'll be hearing from 2 speakers today, and after each presentation, there'll be time for you guys to ask questions. So if you wish to speak yourself, you can ask to be unmuted by the Q&A tab. And if not, you can just write your question in there and Christina and I will read it out to you. We'll read it out to the speakers. So we'll be keeping an eye on that through the presentation as well. And if there's a question that we think needs to be asked for clarity during a presentation, we'll speak up. So the Q&A tab, Christina, I think that I can't see that. Is that right? One of those I wasn't able to see last time.
So what you can't see is the hands that go up. So
okay.
I think that's what so if somebody wants to speak, they can raise their hand. We do have one person that's calling in via phone. I don't recognize it as a local phone number, but I will, once we get to the question period, I'll allow that person to talk because I need to initiate the talk for them to *6.
Okay.
Yeah, the raise a hand, but all the panelists will be able to see the Q&A.
And so the raise a hand option, is that in the chat?
Should be right at the very bottom of the screen. You've got 4 options, Q&A, chat box, and raise a hand.
Okay. I think if the speakers probably won't see that option, but I think you do.
Yeah, just the webinar, just the attendees. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get right to it. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Peatt is a senior professional wildlife biologist and executive director of the Southern Interior Land Trust, During his career, he's worked with the province of BC, the BC Forest Practices Board, Okanagan Nation Alliance, and private consulting for non-profit conservation groups, First Nations, the forest and mining industries, and the government. Al brought the Love Your Lake program to BC for the first time in 2019, and so far has assessed over 800 lakeshore properties on 7 lakes. And he's going to tell us about the Love Your Lake program during his presentation. He recognized that our lakeshore environments are changing rapidly due to various human impacts, and he believes that by helping lakeshore landowners add to the knowledge they already have about their lake, it'll help them to better protect their own interests and the lake environment. So thank you very much, Al.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate being here. Shall we get into it?
You bet.
Great. That was such a nice introduction. It pretty much does the presentation. So there we go. Are you going to share me, Christina, or shall I do it from here? You're already on it. Okay. Just 1 second while I get organized here. There we go. Okay, so this presentation, thank you very much for coming and listening, and much appreciate it. Presentation is called Healthy Shorelines for Healthy Lakes, because the two are linked absolutely. And if you expect to have a good quality lake and protect your interests as lakeshore property owners or just people that enjoy the lake, then we do have to realize that the shoreline is an important part of the lake. And why did we want to bring this program to it? What I will do is explain the Love Your Lake program a little more detail through the course of the talk, why the Southern Interior Land Trust was interested in it, and how I got to be interested in bringing it here. So I was very fortunate. We have lakefront property in Ontario, and I learned about this program out there. And my wife, until recently, was an environmental planner here in the Okanagan Valley as well. I'm in Penticton, by the way. And we were seeing over the last 10 to 20 years just really rapid change in the lake environments here in the Okanagan, mainly from redevelopment. And so from a land trust perspective, our land trust is small, it's volunteer run. We focus on securing these little gems and jewels of wildlife habitat that sort of help animals move through developed and developing areas. And the lake shores are, especially in this valley, because the lakes are quite large, the lake shores, and you would appreciate this on Christina Lake, are pretty important animal movement corridors for wildlife, whether it's birds hopping from patch to patch, or deer walking the shoreline, or elk in your area walking the shoreline. They really do make use of the lake shores quite a lot. And as those lake shores are developed and vegetation is removed, then the habitat's impacted. Basically, there's less habitat for those animals, which is what was generating Silt's interest in the program, because frankly, I don't think there's any conservancy that can afford to purchase, even if it was available, lakeshore habitats in this part of the world for strictly for the purpose of conservation now. So we wanted to reach out to shoreline property owners, try and get as much professional information and good quality stewardship information directly into their hands. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment as well. So enough with this boring intro slide.
So we're not seeing your slides yet.
Uh-oh, that's not good. Hang on, I thought you shared my screen.
Oh,
So
sorry.
my apologies, I thought you had done it, but I goofed it up now. That's not good. 1 second. Okay, this is going to be more of a challenge. I apologize. So what are you seeing there? Just me?
Just the 4 videos.
Are you able to share my screen, Christina?
You would need to actually send me your presentation.
Oh, that's not good. Oh, okay, take a break, everybody. A little half-a-minute break while I figure this out. Sorry about this.
Not at all. And I can give you a quick email if you want.
No, I think I can get it.
Okay.
I just have to get back onto the Zoom screen. I thought it was there, frankly. For whatever reason, I'm not seeing the Zoom control screen here. Oh, hang on. I think I know where I can get it. Oh, right up here. 1 sec. And we'll try that. Are we there yet?
Not yet.
Okay. I don't like it when things change.
I know.
Let's carry on with something else.
We've actually got a lot of people that have commented through the chat about where they're coming in from. So that's pretty neat. There's definitely some people outside of the Christina Lake area, but a lot, of course, as expected, most are within the Christina Lake area. And I'm just sort of trying to figure out how many are shoreline property owners versus those that aren't
So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to end my slideshow here for a minute and try and figure this out. So we're gonna, tell me when you see something, please.
Can you see the share screen option yet?
Oddly enough, no. I had it here just before the presentation started, and then
You might have to minimize your screen.
there we are. No, that's not it either. Oh, fuck.
No worries. If you want to email it to me.
I don't know how I'm going to email a 27 slide presentation.
Fair enough.
That's okay.
Thank you, Ernie, for the host comment. Actually, as a panelist, panelists would have similar. Oh, no worries, Al.
What do you mean? Well, I don't like it when things work in practice and then they don't work. I just don't follow that. And for whatever reason here, I'm not seeing you as a Zoom screen at all. So, I mean, I can see a picture of Christina and that's all I'm seeing.
Okay, so if we go back to, if you just go to your presentation on your screen, have you found that?
Yep.
Perfect. So we'll just click on that. Have you got the Zoom option still?
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I'm not seeing are the Zoom options.
Okay.
That is exactly what I'm not seeing. I'll tell you what, why don't you switch over to Tim and let Tim do his presentation and then we'll figure this out in the background.
And I think what we'll probably do is I'll work with you, Al, and see if we can email it to me.
Yep, sure.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, my apologies, everybody.
That's okay. So I will introduce you then, Tim. Tim's originally from Tasmania, Australia. He's got a background in aquatic ecology and forestry. He moved to Canada in 2008 to ski and loved it so much he decided to stay. It's easy to see that. It's a beautiful spot. Tim's been in Nelson since 2016, where he's responsible for reviewing permits under the BC Water Sustainability Act, as well as being involved in any habitat issues and projects that come up in the West Kootenays. And that area would be from the boundary across to the Purcell Mountains east of Kootenay Lake. His passion lies in conservation initiatives, habitat reclamation, and anything that enhances the beautiful environment that we live in. Thanks, Tim.
Hi, folks. So I have the dubious honor of trying to warm the crowd with a presentation on legislation. So I'll do my best to try to make it entertaining for those folks that have joined us. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. We'll see if this works a little better. How's that?
That looks good.
You can see my full screen there?
Yep.
All right. So like I mentioned just in the brief intro there, I'm going to be talking about working in and around water and kind of what the legislative process is, at least from a provincial perspective, because there's numerous levels of legislation that apply to any potential work in and around water. And then what some main considerations for people planning your project. So the talk itself, I'm going to split it out, describe some common projects that people as landowners might be contemplating or see happening around the lake and some surrounding streams. We'll go through some of the different legislation and then focus more specifically on the Provincial Water Sustainability Act, that's the WSA, the types of permits that are involved under that legislation, some project planning considerations, and we'll walk through one of the better planning documents that's available for Christina Lake that I find is really helpful in bringing together all those considerations for any potential project. And then list some of the provincial contacts that are out there for any questions you might have for potential application that you're thinking about, or if you want some more information on anything habitat specific, or if you see something happening out on the landscape that maybe might be in non-compliance with some of the legislation we talk about. So some of the reporting hotlines too. And then I want to hear back from some of the folks that are on the call with your questions, because it's probably more interesting than the legislation piece that I'm going to be speaking to. So we'll jump right into it. So what are the common projects that we might come across when we really talk about working in and around water? So in a lake environment, the obvious one is docks. Most landowners, especially if they're down on the lakeshore, want access to the water for their boats, or even just as a platform for swimming and whatnot. So the most common application that we receive as a government is an application for a dock installation. Another common one is installation of a retaining wall, especially for those properties that abut right up to the water edge. You might see a retaining wall right on the water edge, like you see in this photo here. And oftentimes they're set back on the top of the beach, but as we'll have a look in some of the later slides here, that's still covered under the jurisdiction of the Water Sustainability Act. So a permit would still be required to do that type of work. This one's a little bit on the extreme end, but it's dredging. And in a lake environment, especially on a smaller lake that doesn't have an industrial side like this photo here from Ontario, dredging really comes up, I find, from owners of docks that have found that sediments accumulated around the areas of the dock where it's restricting boating access. So they'd like to dig out some of that accumulated sediment so they can still use their dock. So we find that's a pretty common one. On Kootenay Lake, where I am based in Nelson here, we find this type of work around breakwaters and marina quite common. So on a stream setting, culvert installation or maintenance, that's a pretty common one. We find a lot of roadways are crossing our creeks, so culverts are pretty common. Beaver dam removals. We actually just got an application from a resident on Sutherland Creek that's looking to do the removal of a series of beaver dams there. We often find that the dams themselves pose a risk of flooding for adjacent landowners, but also they can have implications for fish passage and the streams entering Christina Lake. The migration of kokanee and facilitating fish passage for kokanee spawning is pretty important. And another hot topic, especially in Christina Lake, but it's certainly not unique to Christina Lake, is the treatment for invasive aquatic species. So this photo here is milfoil. You might have come across it. The Eurasian water milfoil is the introduced species here in Canada. And the regional district have a pretty substantial program every year to try to control and remove milfoil. So this is another common project that we come across. So what are some examples of legislation that apply for any potential project that happens in and around water? So at the regional level, we have some zoning and bylaw restrictions that mainly relates to construction and setbacks from high water marks, that sort of thing. It's not something that I'm involved in directly. My responsibility is more at the provincial level. So we have, I've listed some of the more common legislative acts that apply. This is certainly not the complete list. It really depends on what the project is that's being proposed. But the most common ones are any works in and around the water requires a permit under the Water Sustainability Act. If the proponent is proposing to install a structure that's going to be permanent on the land base, then they need a license under the Land Act to occupy Crown land. and potentially there might be implications for wildlife under the Provincial Wildlife Act. So not only do you have to consider regional and provincial legislation, but also we have federal legislation. And this more speaks to the Fisheries Act. The federal government still has jurisdiction over species under the Fisheries Act, so that's fish and fish habitat. Another common legislation that comes up is the Species at Risk Act. So any occurrence for a listed species under SARA, the Species at Risk Act, would have to consider that legislation too. And potentially if there's some alteration of riparian habitat, then potentially the Migratory Bird Convention Act needs to be considered too. So we're going to focus primarily on the Water Sustainability Act. That's certainly where I have my expertise, and it's more often than not the primary legislation for any work in and around water. So the Provincial Water Sustainability Act, how is it defined? And a lot of the legislation in that act speaks to the definition of a stream. And this definition is pretty broad. So if you look at the literal definition from the act, it reads as a natural watercourse, including a natural glacier course or a natural body of water, whether or not the stream channel of the stream has been modified or a natural source of water supply. So how do we translate that? It pretty much applies to all natural watercourses, ponds, wetlands, springs, lakes. And a big key here is whether they're permanent or not. So that speaks to streams that might dry up in the summer, but run during freshet in spring or potentially in winter. So even if they have water in it only at certain times of the year, it's still covered under the Provincial Water Sustainability Act. And another big consideration is, unlike a lot of provincial legislation, this one applies to private land. So the Crown, the BC government still has jurisdiction over all water resources in Canada. And this applies to even those streams that occur on private land. So for a stream, the jurisdiction of the Water Sustainability Act is really defined by the top of bank. So if you have a look at the picture on your screen there, we see kind of, can you see my cursor on the screen there?
Yeah.
Yeah, we sure can.
Perfect. So at the bottom of the screen here, we have the obvious watercourse. That's where most of the water is conveyed here. But as we move up, we see like a more gentle slope profile on this side of the picture. So we come up out of the water, we have start entering the riparian zone, and we get to the highest elevation here at the top of bank. And this is the boundary of the Water Sustainability Act. On the other side, it's a more steep bank profile, but we're still looking at the top of bank on that side as well. So anything between these 2 points, between the top of bank, any work that's occurring in this area would technically need a permit under the Water Sustainability Act. So in a Christina Lake example, any of the properties that are adjacent to those streams that are feeding into Christina Lake that might want to be doing work, whether it's installing a culvert or removing some vegetation within the top of bank of those streams, you would need to apply for a permit under the Water Sustainability Act. For a lake situation, the definition is a little different. So instead of the top of bank that we have for a stream definition, we use this upland separation where as we're coming out of the lake here, we're getting a lot of aquatic vegetation. And it's where that aquatic vegetation transitions into some more of the trees and shrubs that we see on those dry upland habitats. So where the vegetation changes from more aquatic to terrestrial, that's where the upper limit is for on a lake situation. And that coincides with what we call the natural high water mark. So in a situation like Christina Lake, usually that's the top extent of a beach where it transitions in to more of that shrub tree habitat is the boundary for the jurisdiction of this act. So anything that happens below that line, so on the beach back down into the water, would be covered under the provincial act. So what are the permit types that we have available to us under the Water Sustainability Act? And it really depends on what the purpose is. So if we're looking to divert water, we're looking at more of a water license or use approval. So this is outside of the diversion of water for personal consumption in a household. It's more for irrigation purposes, situations where you might be exceeding the water limit that a domestic license covers. You might apply for a water license, which is an ongoing license, or a use approval, which is kind of short-term water license up to 2 years. But for most landowners, what they're looking at if they're applying to make a change in and about a stream, so whether that's installing your dock, a culvert, vegetation removal, you're looking at what we call a Section 11 authorization. So that's a permit to make a change in and about a stream. And under that permit, there are 2 application streams. You have the approval process and the notification process. So the notification process is meant for low impact activities or low risk that, and they're defined under the regulation. So it's not up to the discretion of anyone in government. It's a predefined list of those activities. And the biggest difference is that is the review process and the review length time. So a notification, because they're already deemed low risk, has a shorter review period of 45 days is the maximum time. And any application that comes in goes to our front counter staff, and they make sure that the application is complete, and then they pass it on to a habitat officer, which in this case is me for Christina Lake. So I do a short technical review of the project and make sure that it's not going to impact any of the habitat values, and then I'll issue an authorization, maybe with some conditions that have to be abided by to make sure that those habitat values are protected. For an approval, the application still comes into our front counter staff, but it then gets handed to our water stewardship division. And then the project is referred out to multiple stakeholders. So in this case, it's anyone that has a vested interest in the area that could potentially be impacted by the application. So it might be surrounding water license holders that might get consulted for this project. First Nations are also consulted in this respect too. And it also comes to me as a habitat officer. So approvals generally take up to 3 months, depending on the application, but it's a more in-depth, thorough review. So that's kind of the 2 differences between those application streams. So this just gives a bit of an example of those types of projects that might qualify under notifications. And oh, I got a spelling mistake there. Just drew attention to it as well. Moving on. So notifications, like I mentioned, these are all predefined under the regulation, but some examples are culvert removal, installation and maintenance is all covered. Bridges, as long as they're a clear span, so they're bridges that pretty much cover the entire or span the entire length of the stream. So there's no pylons in the middle of the stream. That also includes docks, the repair of existing erosion protection structures, the removal of aquatic invasive species, and the removal of beaver dams. So these types of projects would all qualify under that short review period of 45 days applications to front counter, to the habitat officer, and then back to the proponent. So some examples of an approval would be the installation of new erosion protection structures. So it might be riprap protection on a eroding stream bank. It might be the installation of a retaining wall on a property on the lakeshore. It could be any sort of foreshore development, so beach grooming, rock block removal on the foreshore itself. Dredging would also qualify. It's a pretty impactful activity. Any kind of riparian modification, stream channel realignments. We don't really get a lot of those types of applications, but they are out there. And any situation where you're dewatering the stream or area itself. So what are some things to consider for you if you're thinking about a project in and around the water? So a big consideration is where is your project located? And does that area overlap with any known sensitive sites on the lake? So for Christina Lake, luckily we have the Okanagan Foreshore Protocol that was developed in 2009. And as a part of that, they went out to Christina Lake and they mapped some of these sensitive areas. So they looked at areas where there was known kokanee spawning, shore spawning populations, areas with known species at risk or high habitat values, and they put them on a map. So you can point to that map and then overlay where your project would occur and see if it coincides with one of these sensitive sites. Another question to ask yourself is, does your project qualify as a notification or an approval? This is more in relation to the timing of your project. Obviously, if your project falls under that approval stream, you'll need to leave some more time for that review process. So like I mentioned before, typically that could be up to 3 months. So you just have to account for that in your planning process and get your application in ahead of time to make sure that you're not getting held up by any permit approvals. Is the project planned at a time of low risk? So we as government officials, we have a number of documents that identify when construction in and around water would have the least impact on environmental values. And we call these the timing windows. So we recommend that any construction that happens in and around water occurs within these timing windows, these areas, times of low risk. And for Christina Lake, it really depends on where the project is. So if it's associated with some of the larger streams, so Sandner, McRae, Sutherland, then they have their own specific recommended time for construction projects. If it's more just general within the lake, there's a different time involved as well. And this all relates back to what fish species are present in those streams or in the lake, and trying to time any construction project to avoid those periods, mainly for spawning and the rearing of young fish. Another question people might ask themselves is, do they need to hire a qualified professional? This is where that Okanagan Foreshore Development Protocol is really handy, because there's a flow chart, and we'll go through an example in the next couple of slides here that can help identify when hiring a qualified professional might be of use. Usually for projects that are listed as a notification and are conducted within the low risk timing window, there's not a need to hire a qualified professional, but it's really dependent on the project itself. And another big consideration is, have you left enough time for the review of your permit application? So this goes back to whether it's a notification or an approval, but it also relates to some of those other legislative permits that you might need as well. So what are some of the resources that we have out there for getting some information? I've already mentioned the first one, which is the Foreshore Development Protocol, and we'll go through an example in the next 3 slides here. Some other documents out there are best management practices documents, or BMPs, that the government has a collection of. The timing windows I mentioned as well. You can also contact BC government representatives. We're public servants, so we're here to answer questions and whatever concerns the public has. So by all means, feel free to reach out to either front counter or habitat biologists like myself for more information. For those of you that have access to online resources, we do have some provincial inventory and mapping that's available through Habitat Wizard and IMAP platforms. And also we have a pretty big database of some provincial reports that might be specific to certain areas around Christina Lake, and they're in our Ministry of Environment databases. If you're after some information as well, you can also contact the local stewardship societies. So the Christina Lake Stewardship Society is also, Susie, a fantastic resource for information around the lake, or some of the other local streamkeeper associations as well. And also qualified professionals. So they're, that's their job to know not only what the habitat values out there, where to look for that information, but also what permits will be required for your project. So here's an example of the mapping that was done for Christina Lake. And I apologize if people can't really see the picture that well, but I'll try to go through it. So bear with me here. So this protocol is not specific to Christina Lake. It was developed by folks in the Okanagan region for the multitude of lakes in that area, Christina Lake being one of them. But the key here, if people can see on the right-hand side here, there's a number of habitat zones. So the colors on the shoreline here relate to habitat sensitivity, black being the highest level, and then through red, yellow, and then no color. There's also some mussel habitat zones, but I don't believe there's any on Christina Lake. They more speak to some of the more popular lakes like Lake Okanagan, Skaha Lake, that sort of thing. So if we look on Christina Lake here, you can see there's only a few areas of red here, mainly up around Sander Creek at the top end of the lake. There was a shore spawning population of kokanee that was identified here near Texas Creek, down by McRae. We also see some yellow and red, and then pretty much on all the surrounding confluences of streams into Christina Lake, we see that yellow coloring. And so if we know where our project is located, we know if they coincide with some of these areas of sensitive habitat, and then we can take it to the next level of planning, which is the activity risk table. So if you have a look at this table here, we have all the different types of activities you might come across working in the water. So from your docks down to boat launch upgrades, all the way down to mooring buoys. So we look at that table and identify where our project sits. And then across the color zone here are those shoreline colors we looked at on the other map here. So for example, if we're proposing a dock that was in an area of red, we look across and it's an H, which is a higher risk activity. We then look at the higher risk flow chart that's also in the protocol, and then go through the chart process. If we're looking at dredging, like I mentioned, it's a very high risk activity, and we see that it's high risk within black and red areas, but then once we get into those yellow zones and areas of no color or low risk, it becomes high or moderate. So once we cross-reference our project, we get our risk, and that takes us to our flow chart. So the flow chart here in this example is for projects that are within the no color zone. And you pretty much start at the top and then work your way through. So we've noted that our application coincides with none of the colors on the map. We've determined our activity risk. Just for this example, let's say we have a moderate risk. So then we just follow the flow chart all the way down through. And the flow chart here is, if we follow this one down, BMPs are those best management practices documents. ROS refers to the old Fisheries and Oceans regional operational statements. So they're a very similar document to a best management practices document, but tailored to a specific region and created by the federal government. So in this case, if you couldn't adhere to those recommendations in a best management practices document, you would come down this pathway, which is encouraging you to engage a qualified professional to help ensure that your project doesn't result. An HADD is it's a harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of habitat, and it's a designation under the Federal Fisheries Act. So this planning document tries to account for all those types of legislation we need to consider, not just the Provincial Water Sustainability Act. So I encourage anyone that's proposing to do a project on Christina Lake to have a look at this document and just practice going through and identifying where your project is located, what the activity risk is, and then the procedure for applying for any potential permits. So what are some of the contacts that are available? So for questions on applications, because all of our applications come through our front counter group, they are a really great resource if you've got questions on filling out the application, where application forms are located, that sort of thing, what is required to include in your application. Our front counter staff can really tell you what you need there, and you can contact them by phone or through their email. But if you're more old-fashioned and want to actually chat with someone face-to-face, we have some offices in Castlegar and Nelson where you can drop in and have a chat with people. Sadly, we don't have any representation in Grand Forks or Christina Lake. But if you are passing through or in the Castlegar and Nelson area, we definitely have people there you can chat to. For wildlife habitat information, I really encourage you to reach out to regional biologists, so people like myself, or all of our biologists are based in Nelson. So if you call the generic Nelson office number there, they'll put you through to who can best help you with your inquiry. And for those folks that might witness or see some activities that are a little suspect or they think are potentially causing damage to the water environment, you can contact the provincial RAP hotline, so report all polluters and poachers, or poachers and polluters, on their anonymous toll-free hotline, or also the Federal Fisheries and Oceans Canada hotline there as well.
And I'll mention too that when you put in a RAP call, you can do that online if you go onto the BCCO service. So if you don't feel like calling and talking into somebody, you can just type it all in.
Susie. And that's it. Hopefully I haven't put everyone to sleep. But if you've got any questions, by all means, throw them at me and I'll do my best.
So we have one from the Q&A. You had showed a diagram that showed the natural boundaries of the lake in the earlier part of your presentation.
Yep.
So somebody was asking, where does the natural boundary of the lake, of our lake, fall in that diagram?
So it kind of depends. I think this diagram is kind of in it's true in a lot of situations where the foreshore hasn't been modified at all, and we still have that vegetation transition that we can use to say, here's the limit of aquatic vegetation to upland. This is the high water mark. Anything below this would qualify. For a lot of situations on Christina Lake where the foreshore has been modified, it's typically the upper extent of the beach and where that upstream extent of wave action has caused erosion to create the beach in effect. But if there's any doubt, I encourage you to reach out to folks like me. It's handy if you have a picture you can take where I can more easily point to where that might be. Or if you're planning a project in these areas and have a question of whether or not the Water Sustainability Act applies, I'm more than willing to come out and have a look in person and walk you through it too.
Thank you. There was a question as well about replacing very old docks. Does replacing very old docks with concrete ones require permits? So I know that we've talked to you a little bit about this with our derelict dock program, but.
Yeah, so if we go to our example table here, we can look down in the misspelt notification column, and we have dock or pier removal, installation, or maintenance. So the repair or replacement of a dock would fall under this category. But essentially, if you're planning any type of work in an area that's under the jurisdiction of the Water Sustainability Act, you will likely need a permit of some description. So it then becomes, well, does my project more fit as a notification or an approval? And if you still have questions, by all means, give me a call.
I was going to read another question here, Christina. I don't know if you were going to jump on that too, but where do private properties end at the natural high water mark?
So a lot of times the actual surveyed boundaries of private land will overlap a watercourse. So it'll either, if a stream goes through private property effectively goes all the way across that stream. And in a lake situation, we've had cases where the actual map boundary of private land extends down into the lake. The biggest thing to think about in that situations is as long as your project falls within the boundaries that we described in those pictures, so for a stream, the top of bank, or the high watermark for a lake, it's under the jurisdiction of the Act, irrespective if it's classified as private or not.
I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat here to see if we missed any. Susie was wondering, if we see someone doing dock work that seems non-compliant, do we report to your office, and do you come out to investigate? And so, and what are the implications of non-compliance? So you had mentioned earlier about the wrap line, and I think that the wrap line is something that people often think that it's only for wildlife, and it really is for any resource infraction. So we need to kind of stress that if you see it and it seems wrong, you call it in.
Yeah, and we really encourage people to use the wrap line as kind of their first preference for reporting any potential infraction. So once it gets reported to that hotline, it gets directed out into the responsible enforcement agency. So for most infractions under provincial legislation, it goes to our natural resource officers, so our NRO program, but it can also get put over to our conservation service too, if it's an infraction potentially under the Wildlife Act or the Fisheries Act, because they have jurisdiction under different types of legislation. And then once it goes to our enforcement branch, they contact biologists like myself to get an opinion on the potential damage or risk for a project and how we really want to move forward for addressing that. So it could either be a punitive fine, it could be an order to remove or stop the work and repair the damage. It really depends on what's been happening.
I'll just mention too, in speaking with the conservation officers about resource infractions, there's a lot of, has been times in the past where people have called into the office and asked us to report things like that. But when you're building a case, it's much better if the person who witnessed what's going on calls directly to the CO service. It just makes, if it does end up being that somebody's going to be getting charged for it, it makes for a stronger case if it comes right from the person who saw it. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And it's anonymous as well. If it's something that you see that could be your neighbor, you know, you don't have to worry about that. There's a few more questions here. And we're going to speak to some of this with Alan's presentation. Erosion and accrual has occurred, especially since the flood. What line is used? So I'm wondering if that's in reference, that was from David Mary, to your diagram, Tim.
On like where the act applies on a lake?
I think,
Appreciate.
if I can, and I think for one of the comments that we're having is that that changeover of the vegetation was somewhat affected because of the 2018 and some of these high level events. And so how does that change where that boundary is?
Potentially. I mean, if you have a look at, is my diagram still up on the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
So where I point to this transition point, kind of on a diagram, it falls here, but you can see that the flood line is above that. So in those cases where it's some extreme flooding event might go above and beyond the traditional high water mark, it doesn't change where that point is. And it really has to be consistent wave action that's causing an erosion or a change in vegetation over a number of years. So a one-off flood event, well, depending on the extremity of the flood event itself, is unlikely to change where that boundary is, but it could potentially if it's severe enough. But it's mostly at that regular high water mark where natural processes are causing a change in the environment, whether a change in vegetation or a change in scour that's causing beach formation, that sort of thing.
These, I'll read these questions. I know a lot of this is going to be answered with Alan. So this is from David Mary. How do we protect shoreline from continued erosion? So if erosion is visible and on the neighboring beaches, and it will eventually threaten homes that are currently well set back. So I know that Al's going to talk about that side of it, but I wonder if you could mention if there's anything to be done from a regulatory side of it, if you notice that something's happening at your neighbor's beach and could affect your property.
It's a good question. Typically, a lot of these projects or options under the Water Sustainability Act are reactive. So we're reacting to a problem, increased erosion or wave action that might be on a beach. For some of those large scale processes, it's really tough to try to mitigate for that or reduce its impact. So a lot of attention is really placed on fortifying the shoreline to prevent any erosion. Certainly if it gets to that point, there are a few methods, especially if it's not, the erosion is not an immediate concern, it's a gradual one, where you could, for example, increase plant density along the shoreline, which the roots could potentially stabilize the shore. some natural ways to reinforce the foreshore rather than kind of the conventional riprap or retaining walls. It really kind of depends on the situation, but there are options out there. And if you do have a property like that, I'd encourage you to either reach out to representatives like myself or engineers or professional consultants to give you some options.
So Al's gonna go into a lot more detail on that with the next presentation. And you
You're
have
on the
some
same page, Al.
pretty good examples, I think, as well. So we have a few more questions from the regulatory side of it. Are notifications that are applied for ever turned down?
Very rarely, because those notifications are considered pre-authorized under the water sustainability regulation, unless the details of the project are completely out of line with recommended best practices, then it's pretty rare for those applications to get turned down. In most cases, if I see an application come in where I have concerns about either the project scope or some of the equipment that might be used or the timing, then I'll put certain restrictions or conditions in the permit to make sure that any work is low risk or does not harm the environment. And if it's my opinion where even with those safeguards, the project will still result in damage, then that might be one of the rare cases where it would decline an application.
And finally, a comment from Monica. Traditionally, there were not a lot of metal pilings on the lake. This seems to be increasing. Is this a concern for the health of the lake?
I wouldn't say there's much of a difference between a metal pylon and a wooden one. Certainly there are situations where back in the day, some of the wooden pilings might have been treated with products like creosote to prevent the wood from breaking down. So in those situations, a metal pylon would be preferential than a wooden pylon treated with creosote. But if you just look at the impact of a wood pylon versus a metal one, there's not much impact itself, other than the fact it's a pylon now in the lake.
And I think that's it. Unless anybody else has any last minute questions, and we'll have time at the end of this. We still have an hour of book time. So if there's anything that you think of while Al's doing his presentation, you can ask the panelists at the end as well.
Well, we hope Al is doing his presentation. Grace under fire. Are you ready for it?
Yes, I still see Tim's presentation up. I don't know. Oh, there we go.
Oh, good.
Okay. Now, hopefully you will see mine. And are you seeing it now?
We do. And
Yay.
I think we had to, because this is your,
You're actually seeing the working sheet, right?
yeah, so it was the display settings that I think you changed last time.
Yeah.
Tech. And how's that looking?
I think it's still thinking.
I do apologize for this. Clearly, I need to upgrade some gear. Is it really thinking? It's just good.
Maybe try again. Try that to change the display.
Well, it changed on
again.
my end.
Oh, it looks like it's thinking
Oh,
on my end
really?
too.
Okay.
Boy, no luck. We're gonna have to book a whole new webinar. Screen sharing is paused. It's telling me my screen sharing is paused. That is something beyond my understanding.
Okay, well then why don't we, just trying to look here.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'm going to try something else. Lost me.
How about if I stop your screen sharing? Do you want to try to do that all again? Would that work? Oh,
We got it now.
you know what? We've got that
Okay.
double screen, and let's go for it.
Okay, one sec. I'm going to try one more thing, and we'll try it again here. Are we there now?
It's thinking.
I would say that we work with
Sure.
the
I don't mind.
actually. Yeah, I think it's kind of nice to see what's coming up.
Okay, one sec. I gotta get back to my other screen. I think the issue is a conflict between my displays here. So we'll make sure it works. Okay, so anyway, a recap. Healthy shores for healthy lakes. I do apologize for the screen. One of the reasons the Southern Interior Land Trust was interested in bringing this project to Christina Lake is because in the 90s, the Southern Interior Land Trust actually purchased about 100 acres from the Sander family at the north end of Christina Lake, where the creek is, in fact, which is now part of the park. So our land trust actually has quite an investment in Christina Lake already. The big reason why, of course, we're concerned about our shorelines, and I'm sure this is not Christina Lake, obviously, but people will recognize some of the issues that are apparent in this image. Tim did a good job, I think, of explaining where the shoreline to riparian area is, or the vegetation that's influenced by the lake. From a Love Your Lake protocol perspective, we look at a zone that's 30 meters wide and extends 10 meters out into the lake. And you're probably wondering right now, well, what the heck is Love Your Lake? Well, Love Your Lake is a property by property shoreline assessment protocol that provides voluntary suggestions directly to the shoreline property owner. So essentially it's a free consultation with trained staff, in my case, a trained professional biologist, giving you advice about voluntary actions that you might take to improve the condition of your shoreline to influence the lake in a positive way. A lot of times, shoreline properties, especially here in the Okanagan, are probably 30% of them are not owned by people who live here in the Okanagan, and the majority probably are owned by people that are from other places than the Okanagan. So they may not be very familiar with the ecosystem or the lake environment that's here.
Al, I'm going to interrupt you for a quick second here. It looks like the presentation is frozen. So I'm not sure what slide you're on.
I'm on one that says lakes are facing challenges, has an overview.
So that looks like your slide too. So we see that on the screen as the next slide.
Sorry, so are you seeing one with a tiger dam on it now? Hang on, I'm going to try and share this screen one more time. I'm going to go up here and try that.
Yeah, there's the dam.
Perfect, we got it, and it's full. It's all ready to go.
Full size now?
Perfect.
Okay, so we were hitting the wrong icon there in the share screen fit. That was it. Okay, so changes on the lake. I'm just going to go back a slide for a moment. It's going to go. There we are. So, so the big changes in the last 10 years on the lakes, and I'm sure you're seeing this on Christina Lake as well. The subdivision of large family lots into smaller lots, and then those smaller lots are having very large houses put on them. So there's a lot of hardscaping. It's coming with shoreline alterations in terms of retaining walls. We've talked about that a bit with Tim's presentation, multiple docks. And then we add on the added recreational use of everybody having a high power boat or a surf boat. So there's lots of wakes and a lot more wave action on the lake. And then we'll add on things like climate change and the chaos that we've all been experiencing in the last few years in terms of more frequent flooding and erosion and damage to properties. One of the big issues of climate change, of course, is lake water warming. And if you consider increased use, especially if you're on septic systems as opposed to sewers, or the change in natural vegetation to things like lawns and the runoff of fertilizers from those lawns into the lake. There's a lot more nutrients in the lakes with development, and with increased warming of the lake water, what you'll end up with is a nutrient bloom. So you'll start to see things like algae blooms and increased aquatic weed growth. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure those are pretty much directly related to the intensity of development on the lake, the amount of nutrient that's getting in the lake, and the temperature of the water. Like a greenhouse, basically. This is called a tiger dam, by the way, because it's that orange color. I finally just figured that out. Tim's done a good job of outlining the legislation. What I want to do is just quickly step through the shoreline management framework, because while we have rules and regulations that govern how developments might happen around a lakeshore, and they're all great. I'm not going to run through them now because Tim's already done that basically. But it really comes down to the community and the people that have an interest in living on the lake and caring for its environment to look after it. And the Love Your Lake program really is about empowering shoreline property owners and the community to take positive action themselves to protect the lake environment. And maintaining a healthy shoreline really is the key to having a healthy lake, because as you can appreciate, all that runoff that comes off of the property ends up in the lake, whatever that runoff may be. So this image, the larger image, is sort of a typical shoreline in Summerland. A lot of hardscaping there. People have pushed out basically into the lake, or the lake has eroded its way into the property. And people have responded, just like I'm sure they are in Christina Lake, with various efforts, regulated or not, for concrete walls, cemented stone walls there, some riprap that's actually trying to buttress that stone wall because I assume it's failing. And these are costly. They're not great for the lake environment. There's almost a domino effect that we've noticed on these hard walls, where a wave action will hit a wall and the energy has no place to go. The wave energy has no place to go. So first thing it does is cyclone, and it starts eating away the footing of the wall. So ultimately, if you put a retaining wall that's exposed to the surface of the water and it gets wave action, it's going to fail because that footing is constantly being eaten away. So it definitely will fail eventually. It may take a long time, of course, but they will fail. So Tim mentioned that approaches to improving shorelines might be natural vegetation. That's not going to work in every case, especially in an already developed shoreline, but it's certainly one that we would recommend quite frequently. And I'll come back to it again later in the presentation. The inset photo is a picture of a naturalized shoreline. And where we're trending to in terms of our suggestions is to try and naturalize with a vegetated buffer to the extent you can. Any buffer is better than no buffer at all. I'll get to that again in a minute. I know you're looking at that inset photo and saying, what the heck, I don't want my shoreline to look like that because I'm going to lose my view. And I got $1 million house and $1 million view. so you don't want to. And I would agree with that. So just so you know, I'm not a crackpot. This is actually our property in Ontario on Monroe Lake in Northern Ontario. It's east of Timmins. And we have 450 feet of shoreline on this lake. It's about a 100-acre lake. We have about a mile of fetch there facing directly south in that image. And we have no issues on our shoreline. And thankfully, because it's a summer place, we aren't there very often, but we have only about 10% of that shoreline is actually altered for human use. Typical stewardship guidance would be by keeping your shoreline 75% naturalized and 25% of it for human use. And this would apply to that 30-meter zone on your property as well from the lakeshore back. That would really contribute well to maintaining the lake environment. It's not practical in every case. I recognize that. It's really difficult to get 30 meters of undisturbed area, or even just 25% of your lot, for example, that's used for human use. It's just not practical. But in those cases, you do what you can. This is our little vegetated area along the lake, and this is just in front of our cottage. This is about 5 to 6 meters wide. If you see the canoe off in the right corner there, we've got about a 20 or 30 foot short, really sandy beach there that we maintain somewhat. Close your ears, Tim, by removing some of the emergent vegetation so we can enjoy the access into the water. And it varies from year to year because it depends on how many people we have there, basically. Sometimes we don't do anything. But I just want to show you that a naturalized shoreline can still give you a wonderful view. So back to the framework, really what I mentioned was that to manage the shoreline, it really is that melding together of the regulatory tools that are out there, as Tim summarized, and then all the other research, restoration, and stewardship information that you can pull together. And these are some resources that you can, Tim mentioned some of them, these are some of the resources you can go to. I want to just, well, you can read the slide. I want to focus on foreshore inventory mapping, which Tim talked about, and generalized stewardship, and how Love Your Lakes fits in between those two things. So foreshore inventory mapping, as you can appreciate from Tim's presentation, scientific process, quite technical, really good for informing regulatory decisions and for scientists that want to understand what's going on in the lake in terms of out here, mussels or kokanee spawning, as Tim mentioned. Generalized stewardship is great as well, and I mentioned two guides in here. The BC Nature's Living by Water is quite an old guide now, but still very relevant. It's if you look up BC Nature on the web, you'll probably find that guide. The Lakeshore Living Guide is a more recent document, which I would say is absolutely excellent. It was produced through the Real Estate Foundation here with Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen. If you go to the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen's website, you'll find a link to that guide. It provides a lot of really good stewardship advice, and it's specific for people that are living on the water. The Lakeshore, the Love Your Lakes program fits right in between those two. So if you were a shoreline property owner, you can't access the data very readily for foreshore inventory mapping, and even if you could, you'd have to be able to interpret it and understand what it means to you and your property. And the same thing is pretty much true of that generalized stewardship information. It's great information to have. You have to be interested enough to read it in the first place. Many people are, but then they hit a stop because it's not information that they can readily take and say, well, okay, so these are all great information, but how does it actually apply to my property? The Love Your Lake program looks specifically at your property in a standardized way, manages to pull together voluntary suggestions that we can actually hand directly to you for things that you can actively do. They're not expensive necessarily, and can be quite simple to do. And the best part is you get to choose what you want to do or not do. And so it really does kind of come up the middle of the two, and it takes good environmental advice and puts it directly into the hands of the people that are best enabled to enact it. So the program itself was developed by Watersheds Canada and Canadian Wildlife Federation about 10 or 12 years ago now. It's done over 40,000 properties across Canada, I think 5 provinces, on about 175 or so lakes to date. We've done 7 lakes now, all in the Okanagan, and about 800 properties here in BC. So, and the Trust is really proud, I think, that it brought this program to BC for the first time. It's a really good fit for here. Little trouble adapting it to urban areas that we have, but overall, I'd say it's working really well. It's very nicely marketed. What you basically get is a high quality report that's specific to your property. The report only goes to the property owner, and any other lake associations, or like the Christina Lake Stewardship Society, the regional district, would receive a summary report for the lake. There's direct contact with the property owners. We usually get mailing addresses through the local government, conduct the shorelines, and then provide those reports back out. And I'll go through that process in a little more detail in a minute. And just as you can, grab that website. It comes up a few times in the presentation. So it's a nicely structured program. The protocol is standardized, and the staff that do the assessments are all trained. And so Watersheds Canada and Canadian Wildlife Federation basically provide the materials, the program base, they manage the database. And then the regional organization in this case is the Southern Interior Land Trust. And the trust itself basically brings the program to BC, coordinates the delivery of it on whatever lake is selected. I should be clear, we don't have funding to bring it to Christina Lake yet right now. The trust has applied for funding through the federal government under a climate action fund to bring it to Christina this year. If if successful, we'll definitely be doing it. And if you want to help out, drop your MP Richard Canning's a quick line. Let him know you want to see it. What basically the trust has me go out and do the assessments with our trained crew, and we liaise quite closely with any lake groups or associations that are there. So I've already been in touch with Suzanne, obviously, and with the Property Owners Association on Christina, just giving everybody a heads up. And if we get funded, we'll be seeing a lot more of each other. The most important people in the whole process are the shoreline property owners. And what we really want to do is transfer knowledge to their heads, your heads, and then have you consider what actions are appropriate for your property and what you want to undertake, what makes sense to you. So just quickly, a lot of programs involved in the process. Now, I put this picture of this cottonwood tree in here for a reason, just to remind me to mention that cottonwood trees, not many people like them because they perceive them as messy or dangerous. Cottonwood trees are your friend. They're from my perspective, they're superb wildlife trees. There's probably 80 species of wildlife in BC that rely on trees for cavities, and cottonwoods are fast growing, produce cavities, feeding sites, nesting sites for so many species. They're just an incredible wildlife tree. I know people don't like them around their house, but if you're in a flood prone area, you got to think that those cottonwood trees are working for you 24 hours a day. They're free pumps. You don't have to put any money into them other than maintenance. And even a young cottonwood tree can move hundreds of liters a day out of the soil and into the atmosphere through transpiration. So every cottonwood tree you've got is a pump that's working to try and keep your water table down around your property or your house. So it's just a little pitch for cottonwood trees there. One of the big benefits of our program is that it engages the community at the association level as well. So not only do each property owner gets a personalized property report for their property, but the lake associations, local governments, and actually we'll post them publicly, will get a summary report that generalizes the information for the entire lake, and that information will be readily available there, and we'll have some fairly motherhoody kind of suggestions for actions at a community level that people can take. And so it's nice because it generates the dialogue basically between the people, again, that make the difference to the lake. So I'm not going to bore you too much with the process stuff, but I want to show you these because these are the letters you'll get in the mail. One of my big fears is that people get the information, think it's junk, and throw it away. There's a value survey. That's this little gray document in the bottom. And that's your opportunity to tell us what you value about the lake, and that helps us tailor suggestions to you. The rest of the information is just heads up about what's going to happen. It gets mailed out in spring. And in the summer, our crew goes out and actually does the assessment. So they will visit every property. We have a GPS-enabled map, essentially, and we know where your property lines are. And we're looking at a distance 30 meters back and 10 meters out into the water. We're looking at structures, docks, retaining walls, how much vegetation is on the property, how much development there's been on the property, where your rooftop drainage goes. It's quite detailed. All the combination of that information, it's all tick boxes basically on a data sheet that you can see being filled out there. And all that information is ground up by the computer over the winter time, and outcomes are very specific recommendations pertinent to your property. And I got to stress again that all of this is educational, it's not regulatory. Regulators, government, or either provincial, federal, or local government, do not get specific information about your property. It's intended for the property owner only, and it's only intended for educational purposes. So I basically have said all that. So this is a screenshot of the Love Your Lake website where you would go to download your report. We don't actually send you the report. What we'll send you in about this time, actually, maybe in March of the next year, the year following. So in 2022, if we do Christina Lake this summer, you'll get another letter from the program that gives you a unique access code that you can go to this website, plug in your code, and that'll give you access to your property report. And then you would download a free PDF right from that site. And if you like the report and want to have a coffee table version, I don't know anybody who's done that yet. You can get one for 20 bucks. That 20 bucks goes to support the Love Your Lake program at Canadian Wildlife Federation Watersheds Canada. One of the things that we spin that we put on the program here in the Okanagan was to try and push it out from an educational perspective into some of the community sites that we were doing. So what we wanted to do was establish some riparian demonstration sites for restoration practices that are effective and cost efficient for protection. I'll speak to one of the questions that came up. It was basically how do you mitigate for flood damage, or how do you protect your shoreline from erosion? I'll speak more about it, but in this image, what you're seeing is some grade 7 kids from Trout Creek Elementary School in Summerland working with a young Summerland Parks employee planting flood-tolerant species. They're native species that are friendly to wildlife, so they're food producing for wildlife or provide good cover. They'll withstand flooding to a large extent, and they're expanding a buffer that's existing in a park in Summerland up against Okanagan Lake. One of the beauties of this, I think, is that not only are the kids learning about actions that they can take to improve the lake environment, but they're also getting to interact with individuals that can point them in some interesting career directions. More specifically about things that happen on shorelines. The program really is about you taking personal action to protect your interests and helping you get the information that you can do it, bearing in mind that you have to do it in a legal and safe way, of course. This photograph actually demonstrates a couple of interesting things. This is Okanagan Lake again in Summerland. Okanagan Lake's gone through 3 flood years now. 2020 wasn't as bad as the earlier 2, but still water was very high. And what you're seeing here, I'm sure you're experiencing also on Christina Lake. So basically straight old ground erosion, some bank erosion in the foreground, issues with docks at high water and whatnot. If you look at the area of the rock that's in front of these sandbags, just in the middle foreground, you'll see some vegetation coming up through that riprap. And this is one of the main recommendations that we make, is trying to get back to having a shoreline buffer, a vegetated buffer along your shoreline, a fairly dense vegetation that has deep roots. And what those do is a couple of different things. They're serving a purpose for you. And I know you're going to want to talk about not blocking your view. That's okay, because vegetation can frame your view, as I showed you at Monroe Lake. What those do is the roots actually bind that soil together, so it stabilizes the soils. It'll grab those rocks and keep all that together, and it's reducing the opportunity for wave action to actually erode. I'm not saying it's not going to erode, but it'll sure slow it down, and in a lot of cases may actually stop it or prevent it from happening. So establishing vegetation amongst your riprap, if you have it, is a great idea. Having vegetation, I'll come back and show you more photographs of this in a minute. Having a strip of vegetation along the front of your shoreline where you might have lawn today is really going to tie that together, and it gives you more benefits, because if you're adding fertilizers or pesticides to your lawn, we're told about 40% of that material actually just runs off the surface of the lawn and ends up right in your water. So if you're fertilizing your lawn and then on a nice summer day you're experiencing an algae bloom in front of your property, you might try and tie those 2 things together. If you have deep-rooted vegetation, doesn't necessarily have to be shrubs, don't necessarily have to be tall, then that surface runoff is interrupted, the material gets forced down into the soil a little, and then the roots take up a proportion of it and put it back into the vegetation, so it never reaches the lake. So you're actually protecting water quality by having an intact vegetation strip on the front of your lake. And again, I will show you a couple of examples so you can see that it's not about blocking your view. I think one of the really nice things about this program is that the suggestions we make are intended for you to be able to manage the vegetation to protect the view, of course, in a legal way. So a question's probably going to come up about those concrete walls. If you're thinking about runoff hitting that concrete wall, and will the concrete wall stop the runoff? Well, not at all, because what happens is that runoff water will hit the concrete wall, run down the back side of it. Usually, if the wall's been well installed, it'll have drain rock back in there, and it just ends up in the water table as well. So it definitely ends up in the lake. So even along the top of a retaining wall, on the lawn side, let's say a retaining wall here, having a even a thin strip of things like red osier dogwood, dense planting of red osier dogwood, or native willows will assist with trying to take up some of that material. Having it, if you have the room, if you have it on the lake side of the wall as well, then that helps bind that soil around your footing and will help actually protect your wall and break it up so it's probably a little more attractive besides. One of our demonstration sites was Peach Orchard Beach Park in Summerland. Again, what we wanted was a site where people could come and see some of the techniques in action. So in this case, the objective was to expand some buffer from existing vegetation that was left behind. These are kind of fingers, if you will, coming in from the lakeshore because there are memorial benches in between them, and we didn't want to interrupt the view of the lake from the memorial benches. So the circles just represent areas that we chose to plant with native vegetation. I want to focus on the elliptical area at the bottom of the screen. So that's the aerial view of it. This is the ground level view. This is in November of 2019. It was a small patch with a couple of volunteer cottonwoods coming up. You can see that taller tree in the center of the photograph. That's a natural cottonwood tree, and there were some other cottonwood saplings around that. This, in the earlier flood, I think the 2017 flood, this area was quite badly eroded along the shoreline with some scour. And what the intention of this planting was, it's mainly red osier dogwood and some rose that we added in these rows in here. The trays in the front are native yarrow. Again, a nice flower that's good for pollinators. It's attractive and has a very deep root, so it binds the soil and takes up nutrients. The idea here was to create a denser planting that was attractive, good for wildlife, that will hold that bank in place during flood times. And the beauty again is that these plants can be pruned low, so you can actually prune them once they're established to maintain your view. This is just a shot of it in the wintertime, March of last year. And so in the winter course, you have a great view because there's no leaves on anything. This tree with the white rodent barrier on it was planted by Parks a little after our plantings. That's why it suddenly appeared. And just to jump ahead to July of last year, Okanagan Lake at a very high level, and you can see this buffer's actually doing its job. So you just go back for a moment. You can see how wide the grass is there. And one more slide back quickly. You can see there's no gravel piled up around the base of those cottonwood trees or the shrubs. And we jump ahead now. You can see how much the lake has, the wave energy from the lake has moved some of the beach pebbles up and actually pushed them through the buffer. And they're laying all along the backside of the buffer. So what's happened is that as the lake level comes up and the waves are now hitting above where they normally would be during in non-flood times, or in an analogy, when your wake boat cruises along in front of your property and pushes a wave up high, the vegetation and the roots are absorbing some of the wave energy that as the water hits those plants. And so it's enough to cause sediments to drop out, which is actually building your bank, not eroding it. And the movement of this, any overhanging branches that are in the water or the stems of the plants are actually taking that energy and dispersing it. So you're not getting that erosive force. And this property actually stood up pretty well to this flood. There was some additional bank scour. It wasn't particularly major, but between the end of the shrubs and that bench you can see in the distance was continuing to scour. And we came back actually this summer and added some more red osier dogwood in that area. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And again, a shoreline property owner with a great view is going to be looking at it saying, I don't want to have a wall of messy looking shrubs in front of my house. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to remind you that that's what you could have, is this kind of view. And I kind of like that view. So other things that can go on. Somebody asked about preventing erosion on their property, and in severe cases, then an erosion control structure might be the way to go. This was actually put in during flood times in 2017, I think, just serendipitously, I think, as a structure that has a lot of potential. And they're called riprap walls. Often riprap walls, especially if you consult with engineers, will be very tightly packed pieces of angular rock meant for hydraulic stability and sometimes in stream situations meant to move water quickly. This, to me, is kind of the ideal situation for lakeshore. And if you look around your lake at places where natural shores are not eroding, you may find some situations like this. So my advice is to often look to nature to see how you can solve your problem, because mimicking nature often is the way. This person just happened to put this in there because that was the material they had available. Probably wouldn't have been their first choice. To me, that's probably the ideal situation. When they come back and plant this with live stakes in between the rock of red osier, dogwood, willow, or cottonwood, and whatever plants they choose, landscaping plants even, don't have to be native, on the top side of that rock wall, it's going to look very natural, and they'll have from the water side quite a nice natural looking shoreline. That's protected from erosion. This is a buffer that I actually put in from one of our suggestions at Vaso Lake, and it just demonstrates that, again, any buffer is better than no buffer at all. And these are mostly native plants. They're not. In this case, the owner really was hesitant to plant any kind of buffer in front because they didn't want to lose any inch of their view of the water. And ultimately decided that between the erosion that they were experiencing off their beach and listening basically to what we were saying about runoff from that very nice lawn they have, they decided to give this a try. So we designed this for them as a demonstration site so their neighbors can come and see it as well. It's mostly native plants, and there's a lot of plants in there for pollinators. So it'll be great for birds and bees as well. This is one of my favorite spots. It's in Summerland as well on Okanagan Lake. And it really is intended to just demonstrate that a naturalized shoreline really is low maintenance, potentially, low cost when you compare it with hard, concrete retaining walls or even riprap in some cases. And basically could be the low maintenance and, most importantly, really attractive. So this is owner's choice in terms of how they frame their view out. This has a lot of non-native plants, but some native plants in there as well. Is a pretty good pollinator garden as well, so it's good for wildlife. And from my perspective, I think it's great to have spaces for animals to move through the landscape, and this is really doing it and providing some diversity and a very nice place to be in terms of enjoying the lakeshore as well. So just a direction to the Love Your Lake website for some more information. These are actually the two ladies that run the program out of Ontario, and they're not sisters, oddly enough. And so I'll just give you a moment to grab that website. It's very easy, loveyourlake.ca. And this is the last slide for me. I'll just remind you the Southern Interior Land Trust is a volunteer-run, not-for-profit charity, and we're always looking for support. So there's my pitch, and any in-kind support that we can get to help bring this program to Christina Lake should be appreciated. So thank you. Now, how do I stop sharing? There.
Thank you very much, Al.
I'm over 60, so technology is a hard thing.
Great.
So we do have a bit of a lineup of questions, and Christina, hopefully you can help me if I miss anything. There was, Ernie asked what type of low height plants might be recommended to not spoil a view. So you did mention the cottonwood, red osier dogwood, and native willow can all be pruned to be quite short.
That's a great question, and one of the things that we provide with our reports is a resource guide, and so you can go to places like Okanagan Xeriscape. If you look at that website, in our reports we'll have a whole list of resource links that you can go to get information about native plants that might be suitable for your area. We often recommend red osier dogwood, native willows, not weeping willow, but native willows and cottonwood as good opportunity plants to use for establishing the base of a shoreline buffer. And then you can build your more ornamental plants off of that. The reason we recommend those is because they're flood tolerant, they're very fast growing, and best of all, they can be pruned heavily. So you can really, you know, once they're established, you can cut them really down low pretty much every winter and then just watch them come up. Red osier is superbly attractive. It's beautiful red stems in the wintertime and has lovely white berries in the fall. The other plants we recommend are things like snowberry, and well, it really depends on your ecological area, but snowberry, Oregon grape, red osier, dogwood would be the key ones. The nice thing about red osier, actually, if I can, red osier and native willows, if you can find a source place for them, you can go out in winter when they're dormant and actually take live cuttings. You can do this with cottonwood as well. And then I won't describe it here, but you can actually live stake plants straight into the ground with very little preparation, and you'll get a pretty good take from those plants if you do it the right way. Cottonwoods, nobody wants them. They're probably, as I said, probably the most valuable wildlife flood preventing plant there is out there. Absolutely costs nothing to have other than the maintenance you put into them. And you can cut them down when they get too big, or you can let the tree grow up and look past it in the view. And that tree will not only help wildlife, but it'll really help you by keeping water moving up into the atmosphere and reducing your water table.
So the Christina Lake Stewardship Society has a native plant nursery, and we do have some of those species that we grow. So depending on who needs what stock, we sometimes do have stuff available. And also Durand's does carry some native stuff as well if you're on Christina Lake. Have tried many. Oh, go ahead.
If you're looking to, if you're looking to source plants, there's two over here. There's Zen Nursery in West Bank is completely native as far as I know, and Sagebrush Nursery in Oliver. So they're also good sources for potted native plants. And they do landscape design too, by the way.
Have tried many plants on the shoreline to try and mitigate erosion and make shoreline more attractive. Many won't survive having feet wet in the spring freshet, and those that do survive usually are eaten by muskrats and beavers. And I've heard that from Barb with boundary invasives too. It's like an ongoing battle in some cases, and they've used electric along some of their projects to keep things out.
Yeah, I hear that problem. I would add deer herbivory to that as well, since the deer can whack the heck out of new plantings. Challenging for sure, and you know, often with these plants, it's a matter of getting them established. And once you can get them established, then you're away to the races. You can start taking down the preventative things that you might have to do to keep wildlife off of them. So if you've got, you know, a chicken wire enclosure and living with that for 2 or 3 years, basically to try and get stuff established, that's what you're down to. We've had good success with deer using nylon fencing, not the cheap stuff that you get to put, you know, protect your strawberries, that fine mesh, but a vinyl fence that's like actually a grid pattern. And you can hang it, you can actually get it in sizes for excluding deer altogether. And you can hang it on tall pieces of iron rebar. So the posts are very thin, basically you zip tie it to the post. And if you get it tight enough, the fence virtually disappears. So you can still maintain your view through it. And then once the plants are established, then you just take it down and you let the deer have their feed. Beaver, a little more challenging. That's the old chicken wire thing, right? I don't have good solutions for that.
Ernie was wondering, how would you measure or recommend measuring the nutrients in the lake, and is that quite costly?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not an expert on this, and we don't focus on actual water quality. We actually take no water quality measurements as a part of our protocol. But there are there are organizations out there that can help, I think, get you set up with a volunteer effort to be able to monitor the baseline water. So I would start with the ministry first off, because of course they're monitoring it. Tim might be able to speak to that. I'm not sure what they're doing at Christina, but in Okanagan, I know they monitor water quality here. Soyuz Lake Water Quality Society is a volunteer not-for-profit group out of Soyuz. They have a website under that name. They have their own boat, basically go out and do sampling. So they have a good protocol set up to scientifically monitor the water quality in Soyuz Lake. And then there's the BC Lake Stewardship Society would also, I think, assist with that. And I'm trying to remember the name of the program. It's Living Lakes, I think. Do you know, Tim? You ever heard of it? I'm not sure.
Living Lakes is a big program. I think when it comes to water quality, I think Susie, your group does some basic measurements for water quality. So looking at like visibility through the water, like turbidity and temperature. And then for some of the other variables like nutrients, I believe the folks in Okanagan still have an ongoing water quality program, as well as Interior Health, who measures like coliforms in the lake as well. So I think there's a variety of groups that do different types of measurements there.
I'm just gonna check the chat here. Susie's wondering, do you include campgrounds on your Love Your Lakes survey and assessments? And there's another, she asked another question as well. I think it's really important for property owners to also reflect on how they use the lake. For example, large boats and in particular wake boats. And is this part of the assessment or education part of Love Your Lake? And I know that that is a big deal. And it's becoming more and more of a big deal. I think we're seeing more and more of those boats. And from what I've heard from some of the landowners around the lake, they're kind of in that if you can't beat them, join them situation, because they feel like they can't wakeboard and ski anymore. So in order to enjoy the water, they're buying these boats so that they can at least be out there. But how does Love Your Lake, or if they do address that?
That's pretty telling about your lake if it's too rough to be able to enjoy most days. Two great questions. The first one was, do we assess campgrounds? The program assesses every property on the lake. So if there's a surveyed property, then it will get data collected for it. It may not get a report generated necessarily for it, depending on whether it's privately or publicly owned and what sort of management there might be. But every inch of the shoreline gets assessed. So when you come to a road access that's come down to a boat launch on the lake, we will assess that road right away. If it's adjacent to a private property, we'll do that private lot. If the next one's a provincial park, then the parcel for the provincial park will get done as well. And all that data informs that summary report at the end of the day. So each property owner, though, would get a report specific to their property. And if they, we did provincial parks in Summerland and at Vassar Lake, and the BC Parks actually took our reports, and they filed them. I'm not sure what they're doing with them exactly yet, but they have that information. So the second part of the question has just like gone out of my head. Was
the wake and wave boats.
Oh, wake boats. Yeah. So part of the program is to take stewardship information and put it out there. So the property reports themselves don't deal specifically with boats, although we do make recommendations around small boats and whether things like boat racks might be useful or recommended in terms of protecting your shoreline vegetation. So we will make recommendations or give you compliments, really, if you are using boat racks and things like that. It's very positive, these reports. We don't deal with large boats on the lake, but we do deal with docks. So we are looking at the number of lifts, the type of dock, the sorts of structures that are there, whether they're crib docks, all the way up to cantilever docks. So most environmental environmentally friendly docks would be cantilever or floating docks, followed by post docks, which is what most people have. Things like crib docks or concrete block docks are discouraged in our work. The boat use itself, I think, is covered within our resource guide. So attached to every report, we have about a 50-page appendix, basically, which breaks into components the various uses that you might have around a lake. And I believe that appendix includes some discussion about appropriate boating. Essentially, it's straightforward advice. You get it anywhere. Keep your wake small because waves damage the shore. In Ontario, on our lake in Ontario, we have a regulation actually that says that we have to reduce speed and not generate much of a wake within 100 feet or 30 meters of the shore. And I'm not sure what the regulations are here in BC. But we were on Skaha Lake last year, and it was actually difficult. We decided, like, if we do Christina Lake, I'm going to probably not do assessments in July and August just because of the wake boats. On Skaha Lake, it made it really difficult with the wake boats there. Because you'd be taking measurements using a rangefinder or whatever, and all of a sudden you're lifted up 3 feet in the air. And so it was just frustrating to be constantly having that bouncing going on.
I found that this summer, taking water samples as well, when we were doing the mussel testing, I also found that it was a little bit, you had to be careful.
Yeah, hard to do a Setri dish when it's going up and down by a meter. And the on Skaha, interesting enough, and I would expect maybe we'll see the same thing at Christina. If the shoreline wasn't rocky, there was some bank scour. There was almost every property had bank scour, so it really is an issue. I have pointed out, I think I sent you a copy, Suzanne, a report by Heather Leratt on Kalamak Lake, or at least a link to it, and maybe you could post that link for people. Mike's mentioning something about it right there.
Yeah, so, I have shared that a few times with a few groups.
So Heather dragged a remote camera around behind a wake boat just to demonstrate what the effect was on silty substrates, basically at different velocities and depths, and it was quite disturbing, really. Her concern, by the way, was about release of heavy metals into the lake environment again from the substrates. So well worth a look.
Just to add there, Al, when it comes to actual boating use, that's all under federal regulation. Certainly that the 30-meter rule from the bank applies in BC waters as well. And if it came to a point where we were looking at boat use that was becoming destructive to some of the foreshore around Christina Lake, then we could potentially look at applying for a restrictive regulation for specific areas of Christina Lake under the federal act. I think it's the Canada Shipping Act. There's a regulation under that for boat use, but it's a pretty heavily consultative process. And if the option was to restrict boat use, I think there'd be a lot of contention about putting restrictions on. So it's not the most straightforward of processes. That's it, Mike.
I'm just going through the comments or the chat here. Who maintains the provincial beach at Christina Lake, and is there a program to improve the swimming area by removing or controlling the weeds? So that is a BC Parks park there. The regional district has a program for milfoil, and I think last year, or sorry, not 2020, but 2019, they were able to make a couple trips around the lake with their program. Last year, because of COVID, they had less people on the boat, so I think they weren't able to remove as much from the lake. But that's certainly something they try to get a hold of every year. Can we buy milfoil weevils to control the Eurasian milfoil? Would it be more effective than the divers? So that has actually been looked into, and I don't think, I think the result was that it wasn't going to be as effective, and that's part of the reason why we haven't gone any further on that. Do you know anything about that? Anybody else? No.
I know that they've used weevil introductions in some East Coast lakes, Ontario specifically. That was more in situations where they had native populations of weevils, because they do occur on some of the native milfoil species, and they were supplementing the numbers. But the results that they got from those experiments were pretty variable. The tough thing with milfoil is it's so pervasive. Like it just, even if you're have a pretty heavy suppression program, it's so easy to recolonate those areas. So I think of all the different measures out there, I think the regional district has kind of focused on more of the manual removal with their dive teams. There's been some talk about using some of the benthic mats to cover milfoil areas and essentially just stop them from receiving sunlight, and it eventually just dies out underneath these the mats themselves. That's been shown to be pretty successful in some BC examples as well. But bear in mind that to do that on a large scale would be very difficult. It's kind of selective for small, heavily infested sites, and even those sites after the mats have been removed are so easily recolonized by milfoil that no matter what method you end up choosing, it's kind of, you're committed to an ongoing maintenance of those areas, especially once milfoil is pretty heavily established in a lake system.
Somebody told me that milfoil could spread based on the size of a postage stamp. So if there was a piece that big that broke off, it could sprout a new plant.
Yeah,
So
that's why it's able to colonize so easily. Not only can it reproduce by the seed capsules it produces every year, but one of the mechanisms that it spreads, it breaks off segments of its of the vegetation that themselves grow roots, and they spread through the water to new sites. So they rely on water movement to spread around the lake. So not only if you've got like boats causing increased wake and wave action that helps spread that species around the lake, methods that have been proposed, such as like I've heard the aqua thrusters are being proposed as a method to control for vegetation, but even those in themselves that promote and create water movement helps move milfoil around, so it can even defeat the purpose.
So we have a few minutes left. There's a few more questions we'll get through. Does anybody know if there's pending legislation to test the water for septic leaks? That's something that
in our program, we have no way of knowing whether there are septic links, but we do make note of where aquatic weeds are and basically how dense they are within the littoral zone, the 10 meters that we look at from the shore out. So it's not a strong indicator, but we do provide a lot of guidance about maintaining holding tanks and septic fields within our and the resources for how to do that in our reports.
And if you have a concern about that, you can call public health as well and just speak to them about it. I don't have the number offhand, but you could call the office and we could pass it to you. And then does anybody have a suggestion for a environmentally friendly fertilizer to promote for shoreline owners? So, and I think that your fertilizers are feeding things, and so I think that you still have to be cautious, no matter if it's environmentally friendly or not.
I think there's some garden products out there that again, I don't think we make any product recommendations within our resource guide, but there are some garden products out there that are touted to be more environmentally friendly in any event, or phosphate free probably. And basically that's what I would look for, is stuff that doesn't have a lot of nitrogen or phosphate in it. The resource links, I think is on our website. Actually, if you go to the Southern Interior Land Trust website and look under the Lovely Lakes program, you can check out some of our interim photo reports in there. And I think we've got our resource links page at the back, and it may have some information about that on there. Not for fertilizers though.
can we pull milfoil out ourselves, or are there restrictions on this to milfoil program only? And so I've talked to you about that before with regards to shoreline weeds. Tim, there was a question that came in there this summer about that.
Yeah, and you might remember from my presentation earlier today in the list of projects that qualify as a notification project. The removal of invasive species falls under a notification. So if you're looking to do some work to pull out those invasive species, you'd still need a permit under the Water Sustainability Act. And that's more of a control aspect to make sure that we're targeting the right plant species, and also we're pulling them out in a way that's not going to cause them to spread too.
I think that may be it for the chat questions. And Ernie, I did see your comment there about the milfoil mat. So I don't know if you've talked with Janine Dougal with the regional district, but she was looking into that for Christina Lake.
And I do know the milfoil discussion was touching a little bit on the town hall meeting last night with Area C. And I think that's were brought up. So I think Janine would be an excellent resource for something that's within the area.
And Raymond, you were asking who we would lobby to get motorboats with more than 20 horsepower off the lake. And I think that that's a really tricky one. And we touched on that earlier about the different user, public consultation that would have to happen with that. And there would also have to be a big enforcement side of that as well, which is something that you would need the resource to do that. Well, folks, we kind of used up all our time, which is great. There was lots of questions, and so that's really important. I hope everybody feels like they got the answers that they needed. And I know that you guys have mentioned earlier, if you have any more questions, there's lots of places to contact, and you can contact yourselves as well, which is great for all of us. And thank you so much for providing us all this information. It was all very interesting, and I think it's really helpful for all of us to understand our lake better, and what we can and can't do, and how we can help support better lake health.
Oh, thanks for putting this on, Susie. It's a great way to get some information out there, and the fact that most of our participants stuck around to the very end asking questions just shows how engaged people are. So it's great to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing it, even though we had the technical glitches, and I hope to see you on the water this summer.
Thanks. And once again, Christina, thank you so much for all your help in the background. We couldn't do it without you.
Fantastic.
All right,
Great.
so this will be posted at some point on our website, which is lakesteward.ca. And next time we're going to be talking about wildlife for anybody that's interested with the BC CO service. So you guys all take care, and thanks again, everybody, for joining. And thank you guys for presenting, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.